Karoline Leavitt stepped into the luxury car showroom, her gaze fixed on the gleaming vehicles. But as soon as she entered, the manager's cold eyes met hers. "I'm afraid you're not the kind of customer we serve," he said, pointing to her MAGA necklace. The humiliation stung, but she stayed silent. The next day, her husband's Rolls-Royce rolled in, and the entire showroom fell silent. What happened next? A shift no one saw coming. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Karoline Leavitt had always prided herself on being someone who didn't demand attention. In her world, being unseen was often the safest choice, especially in a place like Washington, D.C., where everyone seemed to have their own agenda. She stepped into the luxury car dealership on M Street with the quiet confidence of someone used to being in the background. She was there to buy a new car. Just another normal errand for someone who could afford it. She wore the simple, elegant dress that matched the quiet luxury of her life. The necklace she wore, though, was unmistakable. It was a reminder of a time in her life that had been full of promise and a campaign that had once seemed full of hope. The MAGA logo on her pendant was subtle, small enough to be ignored by most, but not so small that it could be missed by someone who cared to notice. As she walked past rows of gleaming cars, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, and Rolls-Royces, she felt the familiar sense of privilege that came with entering such a space. She smiled to herself, thinking how different it was from her earlier days, when every purchase had been a struggle, every decision a result of long hours and sacrifice. But the moment she stepped into the showroom, the smile faltered. David Peterson, the showroom manager, was standing near the entrance, watching her approach. His eyes scanned her, briefly lingering on the pendant, before his expression shifted to one of subtle distaste. Karoline didn't notice at first. She was used to the silent judgments of people in positions of power, people who assumed they knew everything about her without ever bothering to look beyond the surface. But then, he spoke. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave, ma'am," David said, his voice flat but firm. Karoline stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, surprised by the words. "Excuse me? You're not the type of customer we cater to here," David continued, his tone now more condescending. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a moment, Karoline stood frozen. The world around her seemed to hush, and she could feel every eye in the showroom, staff, customers, shifting to her. She could hear the faint murmurs behind her, the judgment carried in their voices. The slight smile that had been on her lips moments before now felt absurd, replaced by a hollow sensation in her stomach. She glanced around, looking for an explanation. Was he talking to someone else? Surely, this wasn't happening to her. Not in a space like this, where she had always been allowed to roam freely. But no, David was staring at her, his face a mask of politeness, as if this was some routine task he had done hundreds of times before. A feeling of quiet humiliation washed over her, the kind that couldn't be erased with a quick apology or a smile. It was the kind of dismissal that cut deeper than any loud insult. Because it wasn't just about who she was, it was about what she represented. "Are you serious?" Karoline found herself whispering, her voice barely a tremor. But she didn't press further. She could feel the weight of the moment, the suffocating air of the showroom as it closed in around her. David didn't flinch, he didn't apologize. Instead, he gestured toward the door, as if ushering her out of the space she had thought was hers to inhabit. "I'm afraid so," he said, his eyes flickering with a sense of superiority. "I'll have someone call a cab for you, if you'd like." Karoline wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned slowly, her shoes clicking softly on the polished floor as she walked toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her own silence pressing down on her chest. Outside, the air felt like a slap to the face, sharp and biting, as if the world outside had no understanding of the sting she had just felt. She stood there for a moment, trying to steady herself, trying to hold on to the pieces of her dignity that had just been shredded by a single, simple act of exclusion. It wasn't the kind of injustice that left scars you could see, but it was one that left an ache deep inside. A place where the pain of being seen as less than, not enough, would fester and grow. Karoline didn't say anything as she climbed into her car, the door closing with a soft thud. But as she sat there, staring out the windshield, her mind raced. Why had he done that? Why had he thought she didn't belong? Was it because of the pendant, the symbol of a past she'd long tried to distance herself from? Or was it something deeper, something more insidious about the way people in power assumed they knew her? Just because of the way she looked, or the way she lived? She started the engine, but the questions didn't stop. They gnawed at her from the inside out, making the engine's hum seem like a distant sound. But she didn't know it then. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly in the car, the engine humming softly as the traffic lights flickered in front of her. The showroom was behind her now, a place that had once felt like an emblem of her success. Now a symbol of something much darker. The sleek vehicles she had admired just moments ago were still imprinted in her mind. But so was the look of disdain on David Peterson's face. The sting of his words, the rejection she had felt in a place that was supposed to welcome her, still echoed in her chest. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening. The road stretched out in front of her. But her thoughts were elsewhere, swirling like the exhaust fumes drifting from the cars ahead. Had she done something wrong? Had she somehow invited the judgment that had been cast upon her just by walking into that space? The pendant, that damn pendant, the MAGA logo, small, almost unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't actively searching for it. She had worn it as a part of her, not as a statement but as something she had carried with her for years. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a reminder of a time when she had believed in something larger than herself. A time when hope had seemed so tangible, so real. But now, it felt like that pendant had condemned her, a symbol that branded her as something less, something not worthy of respect. The thought made her stomach churn. She couldn't help but replay the moments in the showroom, the way David's gaze had drifted over her, then immediately away, like he was trying not to see her at all. The coldness with which he had asked her to leave, as if he had done her a favor. She had been thrown out like a piece of trash, discarded. Unimportant. Max had been the one to call her right after it happened. His voice had been soft, reassuring, a stark contrast to the coldness she had felt just moments before. "Don't let it get to you," he had said. "You know you're better than that." But what was she supposed to do with this feeling inside her? How could she ignore what had just happened? And how could she just walk away from it, when it felt so personal, so unjust? Was she supposed to let it slide? Was she supposed to stay quiet, like she had always done? The question lingered as she made her way home. Could she be the one to speak out? Could she endure the discomfort of being in the spotlight again, especially if it meant facing the very people who had written her off? The next morning, Karoline found herself pacing around the kitchen, lost in her thoughts. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want Max to worry. But it was there, that gnawing feeling that wouldn't go away. The need to confront it, to stand up for herself, for what she believed was right. Max had been through so much himself, his past, the struggles he had fought through to get to where he was now. He would understand, wouldn't he? A sharp knock on the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened it, and standing there was the delivery man, holding a package. "It's for you, ma'am," he said, handing her a thick envelope. She glanced down at the return address. It was from the same luxury dealership she had walked out of just days ago. Her heart skipped a beat. What could this possibly be? She opened the envelope, and inside, she found an invitation to an exclusive event at the showroom, a private showcase of their new vehicles. The letter was polite, almost too polite. "We regret the misunderstanding, and we would be honored to have you join us for this event." Karoline felt a flicker of disbelief. They were inviting her back? Was this an apology or just another attempt to show her she didn't belong? They had made her feel small, unworthy, and now, they were asking her to come back as if nothing had happened. She put the letter down on the counter, feeling the weight of the decision. It was tempting to ignore it, to write it off as just another attempt to smooth things over. But something in her stirred, a voice telling her that this wasn't just about the car. This was about something larger, something that needed to be said. Max walked into the room just as she was holding the letter in her hands, his eyes scanning her face. He didn't need to ask what was going on. He already knew. It's an invitation, she said, her voice softer than she had intended. To the showroom. Max leaned against the doorway. His arms folded across his chest. What are you going to do? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she felt the weight of the decision settle over her like a heavy cloak. It wasn't just about going back to the showroom. It was about showing up, standing her ground, and saying, I deserve to be here. Maybe I should go, Karoline said quietly, not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself. Max watched her for a long moment before he spoke. You've always been stronger than you think. Karoline, you've got this, but you have to decide if it's worth it. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't about fighting back. It's about just being there. Being seen. She nodded, a sense of determination slowly taking root inside her. It wasn't about winning the argument. It was about standing in that space, showing them she wasn't going anywhere. Later that evening, after dinner, she picked up her phone and dialed the showroom. She wasn't sure what would come of it, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She was going to define it. Karoline could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped into the showroom once again. The polished floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the shiny cars still stood in their pristine rows, waiting to be admired. But this time, there was no excitement in the air, only the quiet thrum of tension that seemed to hang between her and the walls, thickening with every step she took. Max, who had insisted on accompanying her this time, walked silently beside her, his presence a quiet force of reassurance. His hand was warm on her shoulder as they moved through the space, his steady stride matching her own. She glanced at him, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he understood the storm raging inside her, if he could feel the discomfort in the air as sharply as she did. She had never felt so exposed. David Peterson stood near the entrance, his posture as rigid as ever, the slightest smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as he spotted Karoline. She could already feel the familiar coldness in his gaze, that same dismissive look he had given her when she had walked in a few days ago. He didn't say anything immediately, but she didn't need him to. She already knew what was coming. Can I help you? His voice was sharp, clipped, and as he spoke, it seemed to slice through the silence that had descended over the showroom. The words hung in the air, thinly veiled with politeness, but there was no mistaking the contempt behind them. I'd like to speak with someone about the vehicles you have in stock, Karoline replied, trying to keep her voice steady, her eyes not meeting his. She refused to show him how much his previous rejection had hurt. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his actions had cut her. David didn't even attempt to hide his disdain. I'm afraid you'll need to leave, he said, his words practically dripping with condescension. We only serve a certain type of customer here. Karoline's pulse quickened. She wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but the words got stuck in her throat. Her mind raced, spinning between defiance and the painful urge to just walk away, to avoid making a scene. Max squeezed her hand gently, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this moment, that she didn't have to carry the weight of this rejection by herself. But it wasn't just David's words that hurt, it was the way he spoke to her. Like she didn't belong here. Like she wasn't worthy of being in a space so full of wealth and privilege. She wasn't just being excluded from the dealership, she was being excluded from society's idea of who deserved respect, of who deserved a seat at the table. Her throat tightened, and she turned her head to look around, but the eyes of the other customers and staff were turned away. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at the cars, at the polished surfaces, at anything but her. David's gaze flickered over to Max for a brief moment, as if considering whether to extend the same treatment to him. But Max remained silent, his steady presence at Karoline's side a silent rebuttal to the way David had tried to diminish her. Then, the silence was broken by a soft but firm voice from across the showroom. I think she's right, a woman's voice said. It wasn't loud, but it carried, cutting through the air with a clarity that sent a shock through the room. Karoline's head snapped to the side. Standing a few feet away was Catherine, a woman she didn't know but recognized as one of the customers who had been in the showroom during her previous visit. Catherine wasn't looking at David anymore. She was looking at Karoline, her eyes filled with something Karoline hadn't expected to see, empathy. I don't know what's going on here, Catherine continued, her voice quieter now, but still firm. But what I do know is that I've been watching. And I don't think this is how people should be treated. Not like this. Not here. David bristled at her words. But Catherine didn't back down. She stood there, her arms crossed in a silent display of solidarity. Karoline could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had expected to be invisible, to be pushed out once again without anyone noticing. But here was someone, an unexpected ally, speaking up for her. For what was right. Karoline felt a rush of gratitude, but it was quickly replaced by a tightness in her chest. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention. She hadn't planned to be the center of a confrontation. But now, in this moment, the choice was no longer hers. The room had witnessed the injustice, and there was no turning back. David's face hardened. Catherine, he said, his voice low but full of warning. This is none of your business. I suggest you stay out of it. But Catherine didn't move. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on David's. I'm making it my business, she said quietly, but with a finality that seemed to freeze the air around them. The tension in the showroom thickened. The other customers shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke, no one intervened, and for a brief, strange moment, Karoline felt the weight of the room shift ever so slightly in her favor. Max gave her hand another reassuring squeeze. You're not alone, he whispered. But even with Catherine's unexpected support, Karoline couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The question lingered in her mind. Was it worth it to continue pushing? Was it worth it to confront the system that had, so casually, rejected her, just because of a symbol she had worn, a piece of her past that she thought had long been buried? She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, she wasn't sure she cared. The days following the incident at the showroom felt like an endless loop for Karoline. She tried to focus on other things, work, errands, the quiet routine of life, but the sting of what had happened in that showroom gnawed at her, refusing to fade. It wasn't just the rejection, though that had hurt more than she had expected. It was the fact that no one had stood up for her. No one had said anything. The other customers had gone back to their lives, perhaps thinking it was just another unfortunate encounter, nothing more than an awkward moment that could be forgotten. But Karoline couldn't forget. She sat in her living room one evening, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and no matter how hard she tried to focus on something else, her mind kept circling back to the same thought. Why hadn't anyone spoken up for her? She thought about David Peterson's face, the way he had looked at her, like she was nothing more than a nuisance to be rid of. And the way the other customers had simply watched as she was escorted out, none of them offering any form of support. They had looked away, avoiding the confrontation. It had been too easy to ignore her, too easy to let her take the blame. Karoline sighed and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of it all settle on her shoulders. She hadn't said anything at the time. She hadn't fought back. She had just walked out, silently. The silence had been her retreat, her resignation. But now, in the quiet of her home, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Then, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the notification. It was a news alert, one that immediately caught her attention. Video of unfair treatment at luxury car dealership goes viral. Her heart skipped a beat. She clicked on the link, her fingers trembling slightly. The video opened, and there, on the screen, was the moment when she had been asked to leave the showroom. It was clear, it was undeniable. The camera had captured her, standing there, rejected, her eyes wide with disbelief, her posture stiff with the weight of being dismissed by someone who felt entitled to do so. She watched herself on the screen, but it didn't feel like her anymore. It felt like a version of herself that had been trapped in that moment, replaying the same story over and over again, as if the world was watching her fall. The video had been shared hundreds of times. It was now a part of the growing conversation that had begun to circulate on social media. People were commenting, offering their own reactions to what they had seen. Some were furious, others simply shocked. But what struck Karoline the most was the sheer number of people who had expressed their solidarity, who had written in the comments that what had happened to her was wrong. She felt a rush of warmth spread through her as she scrolled down the comments. These weren't just strangers offering empty words. There were real people, people she would never meet, who were standing up for her. They were calling out the injustice, calling out David Peterson, and condemning the actions of the showroom. Why didn't anyone say something? Karoline thought, her fingers brushing the screen. She wasn't sure if it was a sense of relief or disbelief that washed over her. People cared. Strangers cared. For the first time since the incident, she didn't feel so alone. Max came into the living room as she sat there, the glow of the phone screen reflecting in her eyes. He paused in the doorway, watching her as she scrolled. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. Karoline didn't look up immediately, still lost in the sea of comments. But then she finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "The video," she said quietly. "It's going viral." Max walked over and sat beside her, glancing at the screen. "What are people saying?" "Mostly people are angry. A lot of people are upset. They're calling it out as discrimination. And they're blaming David." Max leaned back, his hand resting on the back of the couch. "And how does that make you feel?" She took a deep breath, her chest tightening. I didn't expect this. I thought it was just me. I thought maybe I was overreacting." "You weren't," Max said softly, his voice firm. "They were wrong. You didn't deserve that." Karoline looked at him then. And for a moment, everything else in the room faded away. She had been afraid to speak up. Afraid of making things worse. Of drawing more attention to herself. But now, with this unexpected support from strangers, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Courage. But there was still doubt. She had always been one to retreat, to avoid confrontation, to let things slide when it felt too hard to fight back. And yet now, with this outpouring of support, something inside her began to shift. The weight of her silence was suddenly unbearable. Max reached for her hand, gently squeezing it. "So, what are you going to do about it?" She looked down at their intertwined fingers, the question hanging in the air between them. She didn't have all the answers. But for the first time, she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let this fade into the background. Not without a fight. "I don't know yet," Karoline said quietly, "but I'm not staying silent anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It wasn't just about confronting David anymore. It was about confronting the silence that had been built up around her for so long. And as the comments on the video continued to flood in, Karoline knew she was standing at the edge of something larger than she had ever imagined. Karoline Nyan Duok Mo Kwak Goy Bat Go To Roger Collins. Mo Kak Hang VIP Truok De Domwazi Tai Showroom. Roger Tiet Lo Rang An Ta Lamo Noi Da Chung Keen Ton Bo Suviak Va Da Kam Thay Kuk Ki Bat Bin Voi Kash Ku Shu Kua David. Roger Quay Din Kong Kai Ben Vuch Karoline Trong Mo Kwak Fong Ven Voi Truyen Thong. Dong Thoi Chia Se Rang En Da Tung Ju Du Max Leavitt Ki An Con La Noi Vo Jia Ku. An Bay to Rang Max La Noi Da Mang Lai Ko Hoi Thay Doi Cho Rat New Noi. Bao Gom Chin An. Du Ne Gay Ra Mo Ku Sok Lon Cho David. Ki Su That Ve Max Va Karoline Way You Were. I saw everything, and I was disgusted by how they treated you. I've been thinking about it ever since. Her breath caught in her throat. Roger had witnessed it. He had seen her humiliation unfold. And now, it seemed, he wanted to do something about it. "I can't stay silent anymore," Roger said firmly. "I'm going public with this. I'm going to give an interview with the press. And I'm going to tell them what happened. I'm going to tell them how wrong David Peterson was. And how unfairly you were treated." Karoline's heart raced. She had hoped for support. But she hadn't expected it to come like this. So suddenly, so decisively. She had been carrying the weight of this incident alone. But now, someone was stepping forward to stand with her, to speak out on her behalf. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days, hope. "I also want to tell them about Max," Roger continued, "about how I know him, and how he helped me when I was at my lowest. You see, Max is the reason I'm here today. He gave me a chance when no one else would. He's changed so many lives, including mine. I owe him everything." The mention of Max caught her off guard. She knew the story of Max's rise from homelessness to becoming a successful businessman. But to hear Roger speak about him with such reverence, about how Max had given him a chance when the world had given up on him, was a reminder of how much her husband had done. Not just for himself, but for others. You see, Roger continued, his voice softening, I know what it's like to be dismissed by people who think they know better. Who think they have the right to look down on you. Max never judged me for where I'd been. He saw what I could be, not what I was, and I'll never forget that. Karoline was quiet for a long moment, trying to process everything. Roger was willing to go public, to use his own status and influence to support her and Max. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention, but now that it was being offered, it felt like the door to something much bigger was opening before her. Thank you, she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. This means more than you could possibly know. Roger chuckled softly. Don't thank me just yet. It's not over, but I promise you, I'm with you on this. And we're going to make sure the truth is heard. The phone call ended, but Karoline didn't hang up immediately. She sat there, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of Roger's words sink in. For the first time in a long while, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were people who cared. There were people who would stand with her, who would amplify her voice when she felt too small to speak. But as the initial rush of support began to settle, a new wave of fear crept in. What would this mean for her? What would the consequences be for Max? Would the truth about their past, Max's past, be something that would make things worse? And what about the showroom? How far would this go? She thought of David Peterson, his smug face. The way he had treated her like an outsider, like she didn't belong. She could feel the anger rising again. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was a deep, raw need for justice, for accountability. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else get away with this. That evening, the news broke. Roger's interview was live, and the world began to take notice. The video of Karoline's rejection at the showroom had become a focal point, sparking outrage across social media. And the press had picked up on it. The truth, once buried, was now out in the open, and the winds of public opinion were shifting. For Karoline, the moment was both terrifying and liberating. The storm had begun, and she was right at the heart of it. The decision was made long before Karoline stepped into the showroom. She had considered the idea of confronting David Peterson, of returning to that place where she had been humiliated, where her worth had been questioned. But she had kept silent, thinking that avoiding a scene was the best way to preserve her dignity. Yet, each day, as she replayed that moment in her mind, she knew that silence had become a weight she could no longer carry. Today was different. Today, she would not walk away. Today, she would face him, not as a customer looking to buy a car, but as a woman who had been publicly dismissed, as someone who had been disrespected in front of others, and as someone who would no longer allow herself to be quieted. Karoline stood in front of the showroom doors, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Her heart raced, but her steps were steady. This was not about a car. It was about something far bigger than that, justice. It was about what David had done to her dignity, and to the unspoken understanding that power could be used to control, to silence, to oppress. As the door swung open, she felt the eyes of the showroom turn toward her. There was a stillness that filled the air, like the calm before a storm. Every person there, from the sleekly dressed customers to the employees scurrying about, seemed to pause as Karoline entered. She didn't just feel their eyes on her, she felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, and perhaps a trace of their sympathy. But none of that mattered now. She wasn't here to read their faces. She was here to confront David. Max was by her side, his presence as unwavering as ever. He didn't speak, but his hand on her back was a silent anchor, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. Roger Collins, the man who had taken a stand for her, stood nearby, his gaze steady, ready to support her. David Peterson was standing by the luxury cars, his arms crossed, as if he had anticipated her arrival. He wasn't surprised. Karoline could see that much in his eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't seem shaken by her presence. Instead, he looked at her with that same superiority, the same dismissive air that had driven her to leave the first time. Ms. Leavitt, David said, his voice cool, almost rehearsed. I see you've decided to return. I've come for an answer. David, Karoline said, her voice steady, and I've come for an apology. Not just for me, but for the many others who have been treated like I was. She could feel the eyes of the room on them now. The unspoken tension that crackled in the air. David's gaze flickered for a moment, as if considering how to respond. But his facade remained intact. He smiled, though it was tight, forced. "I've already told you," he began. "This was a misunderstanding. Our showroom has a certain set of expectations for the clientele we serve. You simply didn't meet those expectations." "Did I not meet your expectations because of the way I look?" Karoline asked, her voice rising, cutting through the air like a blade. "Or because of the necklace I was wearing?" The room fell silent. Karoline felt the weight of the question hang in the air. The uncomfortable truth she had been avoiding for days now spilling out into the open. David Peterson shifted slightly, his eyes darting around, searching for a way to control the situation. But Karoline could see it. He was losing his grip. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the way business works here," David said, his tone defensive now. "It's not about personal beliefs or preferences. It's about fitting into the right category." "You mean the category of people you deem worthy of being treated with respect?" Karoline asked, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. "Because that's what you're saying, isn't it? That some people, because of who they are or what they represent, deserve better treatment than others." David opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, there was a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible moment when the power dynamics began to tilt. Karoline wasn't speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to everyone in the room. She was no longer just addressing David. She was speaking to the larger issue, to the system of exclusion, to the quiet acceptance of injustice that had allowed this kind of behavior to thrive. "You see," she continued, her eyes sweeping over the room, "this isn't just about me. It's about a system where people like me are told we don't belong, simply because of a symbol we wear or a belief we hold. And it's not just in showrooms like this one. It's in the way people of color, women, immigrants, anyone who doesn't fit the mold, are treated in society." Roger stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "David, this is bigger than your showroom. This is about a culture of exclusion that needs to be changed. It's about the people who have been silenced, the people who have been pushed aside and told they don't matter. But we do. We all matter." David's face flushed, and for the first time, Karoline saw something resembling doubt flicker in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but Karoline wasn't finished. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it go now. "Let me make one thing clear," Karoline said, her voice firm, unwavering. "This isn't just about me being a customer in your showroom. This is about the way people like me have been treated for far too long. I won't stand by and let that continue." David's eyes darted to the crowd around him. The people who had once been passive bystanders now watched him, some of them shifting uncomfortably, some nodding along with Karoline's words. The power that had been so firmly in his hands just moments ago was slipping through his fingers. In that moment, Karoline realized that this wasn't just a fight for herself. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been overlooked, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. And as she stood there, with the weight of the world on her shoulders and the eyes of the room on her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: strength. A strength not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And for the first time, she believed in the power of speaking out. The days after the confrontation had felt like a blur to Karoline. The sharp, cutting anger she had once felt was now tempered by a quiet, steady resolve. The media had erupted with the story of the showroom's blatant discrimination. And what had begun as a private injustice had now become a public spectacle. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, and what had started as a simple video, shot in a moment of raw emotion, had snowballed into a storm of criticism aimed at David Peterson and the entire dealership. David had tried to defend himself, issuing a statement that it was all a misunderstanding, that he was simply adhering to company policies. But his words rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence. Employees who had been present during the incident came forward, giving detailed accounts of the discriminatory behavior they had witnessed. Former staff members who had once been too afraid to speak out were now bravely offering their testimonies. All of it pointed to the same undeniable truth: David had used his power to exclude, to demean, and to silence. The internal investigation into the showroom was swift. As pressure from the public, The press, and even corporate higher-ups began to mount. David was placed on leave, his position in jeopardy, while the company began to take measures to address the fallout from his actions. There was talk of policy changes, diversity training, and even potential legal action. But even as the walls closed in on him, Karoline felt no satisfaction in his downfall. She had hoped for justice. Yes, but she had never wanted to see him destroyed. It wasn't about him. It was about something much bigger than his personal failings. Max had been supportive, always by her side as she navigated the public chaos that had followed the incident. But there was a quiet sadness in his eyes whenever he spoke of David's actions. He understood, as only someone who had been on the receiving end of exclusion could, the pain that Karoline was feeling. Still, he reminded her time and again that this was not a fight for vengeance, but for change, for justice. One afternoon, as the media coverage began to die down and the dealership was left to pick up the pieces, Karoline received a call. It was from David's assistant, asking if she would be willing to meet with him. At first, Karoline was taken aback. Why would David, in the midst of his crisis, want to speak to her now? But there was something in the tone of the assistant's voice, a hint of urgency and something more that made Karoline agree to the meeting. She arrived at the showroom the next day, this time not as a victim, but as someone who had been through the fire and emerged on the other side. Stronger and more resolute, she was greeted with a silence that had not been there before. The staff, who had once looked at her with either indifference or barely veiled contempt, now stood back, watching her with a sense of quiet respect. Even David's demeanor had shifted. He no longer stood with the same air of superiority, but with a sense of defeat that seemed to hang over him like a cloud. Karoline entered the room, her steps measured, her heart steady. She could feel the eyes of the showroom employees on her as she took a seat across from David. He didn't speak immediately, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and thick with unspoken words. Finally, David broke the silence. Karoline, he began, his voice no longer firm, but wavering. I know this is difficult, and I know that I've wronged you. I never intended for things to go this far. I thought I was doing what was best for the company, for the image, for the brand, but I see now that I was wrong. I treated you unfairly. I see that now. Karoline looked at him, her gaze steady but not hard. She had expected this moment, had prepared herself for it. She had spent days contemplating what she would say, what she would feel when faced with this apology. But now that it was here, she found herself not wanting to heap shame upon him. She didn't need his apology, not in the way she once had. She had already forgiven him long ago, not because of his actions, but because of what she had learned about herself in the process. David, Karoline said softly, her voice calm, yet carrying the weight of everything she had been through. I don't want you to apologize because you feel you have to. I want you to apologize because you understand, because you see the damage that was done, not just to me, but to the system you've upheld, to the people you've ignored, to those who don't fit the image you've set. David's eyes dropped to the floor, a trace of shame flickering across his face. He didn't speak for a long time, and Karoline let the silence linger. She wasn't here for retribution, for a moment of triumph. She wasn't interested in seeing him suffer. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was for things to change, for people like her, people who didn't fit the narrow molds others had set, to be treated with dignity. I don't want to see you fail, David, Karoline continued, her voice steady but firm. I don't want to see you punished for your mistakes, but I do want you to stand up. I want you to stand up against what's wrong in this place. I want you to take responsibility, not just for your actions, but for the system that allowed this to happen. You can do better. You can change. David looked up at her, his face pale, but for the first time, there was something in his expression that wasn't just about shame. It was something like understanding, or maybe even humility. I will, he said quietly. I don't know how, but I will. Karoline didn't smile. Didn't expect a miracle, but she believed in the possibility of change. She believed in the idea that people could do better, that institutions could evolve. She didn't want to see David brought to his knees, but she wanted him to stand up and be accountable. For himself, for the showroom, for the people he had wronged. As she left the showroom that day, Karoline knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more battles to face. More moments where she would have to stand up, speak out, and demand justice. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. For the first time, she felt that the change she had hoped for was within reach. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it felt like the world was a little less broken, a little more just, and that, for now, was enough. Karoline stood by the window, looking out at the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. The city, with its promise of progress, had always felt like a place where stories like hers could either thrive or fade away, depending on who was telling them. The aftermath of her battle with David Peterson in the showroom was still fresh in her mind. But the weight of it felt different now. The headlines had faded, the cameras had turned elsewhere, and the corporate machine had begun to grind on. But Karoline knew deep down that the story wasn't over. Not for her, and certainly not for the thousands of others who continued to face the same kind of exclusion and judgment she had. The events had been a catalyst. No doubt, the exposure, the media, the pressure, it all served its purpose. David had been held accountable, and the dealership had implemented changes to address the systemic discrimination that had been exposed. But as Karoline sat there, reflecting on the quiet moments that followed, she couldn't help but feel that the victory, though sweet, had been incomplete. It had been a step forward, but not enough. The conversation had been sparked. Yes, but the fight for equality, true, lasting change, was far from over. In the days that followed, Karoline found herself speaking at conferences and events, sharing her story with those who had been touched by it. But the applause, the recognition, it all felt hollow when she knew how deep the roots of prejudice went. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about a society that still judged people based on their appearance, their background, their choices. It was about a system that made people feel invisible if they didn't fit a certain mold. One evening, as Karoline was preparing for another speaking engagement, she received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was from Catherine, the woman who had silently witnessed the confrontation at the showroom and who had been one of the few to offer Karoline a sympathetic glance in that moment of isolation. "Can we meet?" the message read. "I have something important to share." Karoline's heart skipped a beat. After all the media attention, she hadn't expected to hear from Catherine again. She quickly responded, agreeing to meet her the following morning, when they sat down in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Catherine was visibly nervous, but there was an undeniable spark in her eyes. She was older than Karoline, perhaps in her early 50s, with a sharp, observant demeanor. Catherine had spent years working at the dealership before retiring, but her experience there had left her disillusioned, just like many others who had been silently complicit in the system. "I couldn't just let it go," Catherine began, her voice soft but steady. "I've spent so many years watching things happen, things that weren't right. People treated like they didn't matter. Their voices silenced before they could even speak. But when I saw what happened to you, Karoline, I saw something change in myself. I realized that silence, that complacency, it wasn't helping anyone. It was just letting the injustice continue." Karoline listened intently, the weight of Catherine's words settling in her chest. "I've talked to some of the other former employees," Catherine continued. "We've decided to start something, an initiative, a campaign for equality, not just in showrooms, but in the entire industry. We want to make sure no one else goes through what you did. We want to make sure that people understand what true equality means." A rush of emotions flooded Karoline: surprise, gratitude, a deep sense of connection. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something larger than herself. Something that could reach further than her own personal battle. "I'd like you to be a part of it," Catherine said, her eyes locking with Karoline's. "We can make a difference. Karoline." Together, Karoline felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't about the cameras or the applause anymore. It was about the people, about those who had stood up, those who had suffered in silence, and those who were now willing to fight for a change that went beyond just one person's story. This was the beginning of something real. Weeks passed, and the campaign took shape. Karoline worked alongside Catherine and the others, advocating for fairness, equality, and justice within the industry. They held meetings, partnered with organizations, and spoke out against the discrimination that was still so pervasive. though often hidden behind polished facades. They didn't want just policy changes, they wanted hearts and minds to change. They wanted society to see beyond the surface, beyond the labels, beyond the judgments. But as the campaign grew, Karoline found herself reflecting on her own journey. She thought back to the day at the showroom, when she had walked in, feeling small and insignificant. She thought about how alone she had felt in that moment, and how everything had shifted when she chose not to remain silent. Now, as she stood in front of crowds, sharing her story, she realized that the fight for justice was never about winning one battle, it was about changing the fabric of society itself. One thread at a time. Months later, Karoline found herself walking through another car dealership, this time a different one. In another part of the city. She wasn't there to fight, to protest, or to speak. She was there just to be. As she walked through the showroom, no one looked at her with disdain. No one judged her for the simple fact that she wore a MAGA necklace. The salespeople greeted her with genuine warmth. And for the first time in a long time, Karoline felt what it meant to be truly seen, not for her political views or her appearance, but as a person deserving of respect. She paused for a moment, standing in front of one of the vehicles. It was a strange feeling. A quiet victory not over one man or one institution, but over the system that had made her feel like less than she was for so long. She wasn't just a woman who had been wronged. She was a woman who had fought for herself, for others, and who had made a difference. As she stepped out of the dealership, her mind wandered back to that question she had asked herself so many times. Would society change? Would people finally see beyond their biases? Or would the cycle continue? She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew one thing: she would keep fighting. And maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to fight alone anymore. Karoline stood in that showroom, surrounded by the hum of luxury cars and the weight of judgment. In that moment, it wasn't just a necklace that set her apart, it was a system that silently decides who belongs and who doesn't. But what if the greatest victories aren't the loudest? What if they're the quiet moments when we choose to stand, not for ourselves, but for something bigger than us? The question lingers. When we witness injustice, do we remain silent or do we find the courage to speak? Even when the world seems stacked against us. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, a question, or even a quiet truth, please subscribe to Shadow Secrets to walk with us through more untold journeys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.